We'd like to take a look at discovery procedures in the context of generative grammar and contemporary linguistics. It's a topic that's really little understood and very poorly represented in the literature today. And it's not of just historical interest. It really has an impact on how we think about linguistics today. But it means starting with a careful look at two pieces of writing that actually go back more than 65 years. So one of the pieces, one of the books I want to take a look at is Zellig Harris's Methods in Structural Linguistics, which was published in 1951. And the other is, a pair of books by Noam Chomsky. There's Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory, or LSLT, which Chomsky finished in 1955, and then he wrote he revised it a bit in 1956, and we can take a look at that 1956 version. And then there's the book that Chomsky published in 1957 called Syntactic Structures. So we first need to understand what Zellig Harris was talking about in the context of discovery procedures, although he himself didn't use the term discovery procedures. We need to take a look at that. This has been wildly misrepresented in the literature since. And then we need to look at what Chomsky said about discovery procedures in general and about Zellig Harris's ideas in particular. I think there are a lot of surprises in there. As I say, this is work that's been very, very poorly represented in the literature. So let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to start with taking a look at some of the things that Zellig Harris wrote in Methods in Structural Linguistics, his 1951 book that basically got Chomsky interested in linguistics. So it's a very interesting book. Not always easy to read, but I'll do my best to help you. It's a very interesting book. I'm going to begin by reading some of the material at the beginning of Zellig Harris's Methods in Structural Linguistics. It's really best to hear in his own words what Zellig Harris thought he was doing. So let's read some of it. It begins with an introduction which says, "This volume represents methods of research used in descriptive, or more exactly, structural linguistics. It's thus a discussion of the operations which the linguist may carry out in the course of his investigations, rather than a theory of the structural analyses which result from these investigations. The research methods are arranged here in the form of successive procedures of analysis imposed by the working linguist upon his data. It's hoped that the presentation of the methods in procedural form and order may help reduce the impression of sleight of hand and complexity which often accompanies the more subtle linguistic analyses." Okay, so the first thing to bear in mind is that there's a distinction between what Harris would write in his analyses. On the one hand, those would be articles that he published, for example, in International Journal of American Linguistics or something like that, a professional journal. On the one hand, that's one thing that he would publish. The other is a book like this, and this is to teach somebody how to be a linguist, or to teach somebody how it is that Zellig Harris does what he does when he's wearing his hat as a linguist. So it's in a sense a textbook. It's explaining to people how things should be done and how he arrives at the conclusions that he does. Okay, he continues. "Starting with the utterances which occur in a single language community at a single time, these procedures determine what may be regarded as identical in various parts of various utterances and provide a method for identifying all of the utterances as relatively few stated arrangements of relatively few stated elements." Okay, third paragraph. "These procedures are not a plan for obtaining data or for field work." That's so important. This is not an explanation of what the linguist should be doing, and it's in no sense a set of methods for somebody setting out to analyze a language. And this, of course, is what people say Harris was trying to do, and he couldn't be clear on the fact, as he just wrote, that no, that's not what it is. Let's go back to the second sentence of paragraph 3. "In using them, it does not matter if the linguist obtains the data by taking texts, questioning an informant, or recording a conversation, even where the procedures call for particular contact with the informant, as in obtaining repetitions of an utterance. It doesn't matter how this is carried out. For example, the linguist can interrupt a conversation to ask the speaker or hearer to repeat an utterance that has occurred, and may alter the conversation so as to get its recurrence in different environments. Okay. Now, the next sentence, of course, is important. That's why I've underlined it. These procedures also do not constitute a necessary laboratory schedule in the sense that each procedure should be completed before the next is entered upon. And Harris is going to explain this again and again. He's ordering the procedures in a particular way for the purpose of writing a book and writing something that can be understood by somebody reading the book who doesn't know the contents ahead of time. But the order in which they're presented here does not correspond to a step-by-step description of what a linguist does in starting with zero knowledge about a language and ending up with a full grammar. Back to Harris. In practice, linguists take unnumbered shortcuts and intuitive or heuristic guesses and keep many problems about a particular language before them at the same time. They may have figured out the positional variance of several phonemes before they decide how to cut up into segments certain utterances which presumably contain a phonetically unusual phoneme. And they will usually know exactly where the boundaries of many morphemes are before they finally determine the phonemes. It's not a problem. The chief usefulness of the procedures listed below is therefore as a reminder in the course of the original research and as a form for checking or presenting the results where it may be desirable to make sure that all the information called for in these procedures has been validly obtained. So this is not a set of procedures, step-by-step procedures. It's a way to think about the justification that you've got and that you'll present to your reader after you've finished the analysis of a language and want to justify your conclusions. Next paragraph. We're now on page 2. The methods described here do not eliminate non-uniqueness in linguistic descriptions. It's possible for different linguists working on the same material to set up different phonemic and morphemic elements, to break phonemes into simultaneous components, or not to do so, to equate two sentences of morphemes as being mutually substitutable, or not to do so. That's huge. What he's saying is the way I, Zellig Harris, view linguistic analysis, there isn't necessarily one correct analysis of a language. There can be several, and in particular, the methods here are not developed so as to give a single analysis. Very important. We can argue, obviously, about whether that's the kind of linguistics we want to do, but Harris is ready for that argument. But remember, Harris is not saying that there's going to be a unique analysis given these methods and given data from a language. The only result of such differences, that is, between different analyses, will be a correlative difference in the final statement as to what the utterances consist of. The use of these procedures is merely to make explicit what choices each linguist makes, so that if two analyses come out with different phoneme lists for a given language, we should have exact statements of what positional variants were assigned by each to what phonemes and wherein lay their differences of assignment. Next paragraph. The methods presented here are consistent but are not the only possible ones of arranging linguistic description. So Harris is taking several steps back. He said that the methods don't give unique analyses. He's also saying this isn't necessarily the only way that I, or for that matter you, need to do linguistics. There are other ways to do things, but he wants to explain in this book what a scientifically justifiable set of procedures would look like in some detail. Other methods, back to Harris, other methods can be suggested. For example, one based on relations of selection among segments, whether phonemic or morphemic. As more languages are analyzed, additional refinements and special cases of these or of comparable techniques come to attention. Okay, well, that's perfectly true. That is to say, the more languages linguists look at, the more ideas become available to us as a community, as a discipline. The more analyses become available to us, and then, therefore, the more ways we will think about analyzing a language when we look at it with the crafty analytic eyes of a linguist. The particular way of arranging the facts about a language which is offered here will undoubtedly prove more convenient for some languages than for others. Convenient is an important word for Harris. However, it should not have the undesirable effect of forcing all languages to fit a single Procrustean bed, and of hiding their differences by imposing on all of them alike a single set of logical categories. This, of course, does not resonate within us. We are completely, we are all completely working in a perspective in which the goal is to find a single way that will work well for all languages. And that's not what Harris has in mind here. If such categories were applied, especially to the meanings of forms in various languages, it would be easy to extract parallel results from no matter how divergent forms of speech. A set of suffixes, one or another of which always occurs with every noun, as say Latin is, e, and a selection of frequently used directional adjectives, say English of, to, in, can both be called case systems. The procedures given below, however, are merely ways of arranging the original data. And since they go only by formal distinctions, there's no opportunity for uncontrolled interpretation of the data or for forcing of the meaning. For this reason, the data, when arranged according to these procedures, will show different structures for different languages. Furthermore, various languages described in terms of these procedures can be the more readily compared for structural differences, since any difference between their descriptions will not be due to differences in method used by the linguist, but to differences in how the language data responded to identical methods of arrangement. So this is definitely a different worldview, but the goal from Harris's point of view is to come up with grammars that are as different one to another as the languages are against which these grammars have been written. There's no sense at all that somehow all of human language reflects a single basic language, as one occasionally hears people saying. Not at all. There's a variety of languages in the world, and our methods will be put to the test to see how well they, in a certain sense, identify what the unique or unusual characteristics are that are found in any given language. Let's turn now to look at Chomsky's work let's take a look at syntactic structures first. So this is chapter 6, second page of chapter 6. Let's read some of what Chomsky writes here. So we'll start with this paragraph. We have not yet considered the following very crucial question. What's the relation between the general theory and the particular grammars that follow from it? In other words, what sense can we give to the notion follow from in this context? It's at this point that our approach will diverge sharply from many theories of linguistic structure. We can read into this. It'll differ from Harris's approach, but yeah, he hasn't said this. Okay, so we're going to look now at three models, and these are the three models on item 36 on the next page. Let me read what Chomsky says about the first model, which he calls the strongest. The strongest requirement that could be placed on the relation between a theory of linguistic structure and particular grammars is that the theory must provide a practical and mechanical method for actually constructing the grammar given a corpus of utterances. Let's say that such a theory would provide us with a discovery procedure for grammars. Okay, so we see here a black box. Think of it as an algorithm or a computer program, and a corpus goes in, and out comes a grammar. The natural question to ask then, is this what Harris has in mind? Is this the approach he's taking to linguistic theory? And we've seen already the answer is clearly no. Is this what Chomsky thinks Harris is doing? We'll see in a minute when we turn to LSLT that it's not. So this is an account of discovery procedures. It's not what Harris is trying to do. It's not what Chomsky is trying to do. Let's move on to the second paragraph. A weaker requirement, Chomsky writes, would be that the theory must provide a practical and mechanical method for determining whether or not a grammar proposed for a given corpus is, in fact, the best grammar of the language from which this corpus is drawn. Such a theory, which is not concerned with the question of how the grammar is constructed, might be said to provide a decision procedure for the grammars. Now, is this what Harris is trying to do? We've already seen the answer to this is no. partly because Harris has already said that given data of a language, there can be several analyses which are fine. But I can try to make the case for Chomsky that Harris is doing something that falls under this description. But bear with me, okay? Harris is trying to explain to his reader what it means to do a scientific analysis of a set of data. And that certainly can be interpreted as an algorithm that says, given a set of data and a grammar, we ask, is this a scientific grammar? Yes or no? Fine. But that's not the entirety of what Harris is trying to do. At the same time that he's trying to explain to us what it means for an analysis to be scientific or not, he's also showing how, within a given perspective, within a given set of assumptions, you can iteratively produce better and better analyses. So English, for example, over the course of the book gets reanalyzed as more and more ideas come into the picture. Okay, so what that means is, in a certain respect, what Harris is trying to do could be thought of as falling under this second model, this model that says yes or no, this grammar is an okay grammar for the particular data. But at the same time, the next model, the one which is weaker and which Chomsky is going to say, well, that's the best we can do at this point in the history of linguistics. Let's take this third method, which is an evaluation procedure. That too reflects what Harris is trying to do. That is to say, he wants to be able to say, given two grammars that you're comparing, we want to understand what makes one grammar better than another. And so Harris lays out various ways in which this could be done. You could prefer a grammar which has a smaller number of phonemes, or you could prefer a grammar that has a smaller number of morphemes, or various other things. The difference between Harris and Chomsky in this regard is that Chomsky believes that there's exactly one evaluation method, and that's what will define linguistic theory. And the second is perhaps more important, and that is Chomsky's belief that we can figure out exactly how to calculate the goodness of a grammar. And Harris never comes close to saying we can actually calculate it. Chomsky, on the other hand, absolutely does. So in LSLT, and to a lesser degree in Sound Pattern of English with Morris Halley, Chomsky tries to work out this evaluation method, meaning counting of symbols. Eventually, he would abandon that. He would abandon it basically in the late 70s with Principles and Parameters. But in any event, this is a way to understand the relationship between what Harris is doing in the 40s, what Chomsky is doing in LSLT. So there we are. So let's just finish this citation from Chomsky's Syntactic Structures, 1957. And he writes, an even weaker requirement would be that given a corpus and given two proposed grammars, G1 and G2, the theory must tell us which is the better grammar of the language from which the corpus is drawn. In this case, we might say that the theory provides an evaluation procedure for grammars. And that'll lie at the heart of what Chomsky is doing and what he considers generative grammar, up until the late 70s when he chooses, when he opts for what he would then call principles and parameters, which basically abandons this notion of an evaluation procedure based on global properties of grammars. So how does this reflect on what Harris is doing? Harris is certainly interested in explaining to his reader how he, Harris, can look at alternative grammars for the same data and decide which one is better. But he doesn't do this in the quantitative way that Chomsky is aiming at, and he certainly doesn't point to it as clearly as Chomsky does. So that's where we are. Let's continue. I want to explain the sense in which Chomsky's reference to these first two approaches certainly were a reasonably obvious allusion to something else that an educated reader in the 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, somebody who knew something about mathematical logic, it's an allusion to something that they would know. And it's the big difference between being certain of the truth of a mathematical expression if you're given a proof of it, on the one hand, and your certainty if you're not given a proof of it. There's a big difference between the two. If you're given a proof, something that somebody claims as a proof, in order to determine that you've got a proof now of the expression in question, all you have to do is two things. You have to assure yourself that the step-by-step process that that constitutes the proof is valid. It validly, in an appropriate way, follows the rules of inference that we set up for our theory of proof. And secondly, you have to make sure that it's the statement in question that in fact is the final line of the proof. Has this proof proven what we care about? Okay, that's not hard. Given what is supposed to be a proof, it's not difficult to test that it's valid and that it in fact arrives at the conclusion that we're interested in. It may be hard psychologically, but from a logical point of view, it's not hard. On the other hand, given a statement and a claim that it's true, it's incredibly difficult to know what to make of it. In order to be certain that the expression, that the statement is in fact true, you have to come up with a proof. Coming up with a proof may take tens of years or centuries, or the whole human race may die before the statement, which in some godlike sense is true, before anybody actually finds a proof of it. So there's a huge difference between stating that something can be proven and giving the proof on the one hand, and stating something, stating that it can be proved, but not giving the proof. There's a huge difference between the two. Today, actually, when we teach this sort of thing in a computer science context, we probably reach out to different kinds of sort of illusions. We tend to talk today about finding prime factors of a large number, because this has to do with things that are of interest today about security and the like, and encryption. So if we have a number that's 200 digits long, and somebody claims that it's the product of two numbers, each of which has 100 digits in it, there's two ways we can respond to this statement. On the one hand, we can say, oh yeah, what are those two numbers? And if we're given those two numbers, it's really easy to multiply those two numbers and look at it, see if that product is the number in question. If it is, you're done. You've now established that this 200-digit number is in fact the product of two other numbers, therefore it's not prime. On the other hand, if somebody says, well, I just have a really strong feeling that that 200-digit number, it's not a prime. It has two factors, but I don't know what they are. There's not much we can do with that. In the vast majority of cases, we won't be able to know what those factors are until maybe someday we actually get quantum computers that can do this thing. So a claim that a number is not a prime, if it's a large number, such a claim, there's not a whole lot we can do with it in most cases without giving a suggestion as to what the factors are. On the other hand, if you're given a large number and the factors, not difficult to determine whether, in fact, this hypothesis of this factorization, it's not difficult to test it. So that's the illusion, the difference between having a grammar and determining whether the grammar in fact generates the corpus, on the one hand, and on the other, not having a grammar at all and trying to construct an algorithm that, given a set of data, actually creates the grammar. Huge difference between the two. The first is easy to test whether a grammar generates a set of sentences, not hard. To come up with an algorithm that generates the data given the corpus, hard. Okay, the risk of a little bit of redundancy, but it's redundancy that we can live with. I'm going to read some of the material on LSLT that corresponds to what Chomsky published in Syntactic Structures a year or two later. He writes, there are several possible ways of construing the relationship between particular grammars and the general theory. Certainly every grammar must be compatible with the theory in the sense that the elements set up in the grammar possess in a particular way, the general properties required by the theory, that is, that the system described by the grammar be what is called a true interpretation of the theory. This is the weakest possible requirement. At the other extreme, the strongest requirement would be that the theory provide a practical means for literally constructing the grammar out of the raw data. That is, we might require that the grammar of each language be mechanically derivable from a sufficient corpus once the theory is established. Let's call such a theory procedural. Okay, that's the first of the models in syntactic structures 2 years later. Okay, continue. Thus, given a sufficient corpus, a procedural theory will lead us directly to a grammatical description of the language in some practical way, requiring, in principle, no ingenuity or intuition on the part of the linguist. Let me just add, no intuition or ingenuity at this point. Of course, the ingenuity and the intuition went into developing the algorithm in the first place. A procedural theory gives what might be called a practical procedure for grammars. A weaker requirement than this would be that given a grammar, the theory must provide a practical mechanical way of validating it, that is, of showing that it is in fact the best grammar of the language in a sense specified by the theory. So that's the second approach in syntactic structures, as you'll write it a year or two later. The second approach is hugely different from the first. So the second approach means, what do we do? Can we imagine a linguistic theory that evaluates a grammar that somebody else came up with, given a set of data, and that grammar, can we evaluate? It's like given a proof and a candidate theorem, can we tell whether the proof is in fact valid? That's easy. The previous step, the previous challenge, which was given data, come up with a grammar for it, that's hard. And now this idea that Chomsky is just conflating them and calling them both procedural, it boggles the mind because it just rejects everything that the metaphor was trying to show. And so there's something really wrong here, rhetorically wrong. You don't want to call those two things by the same name. You want to make it really clear how different they are. And so Chomsky goes on, as we'll see in a second, and he says, well, it's this second thing that Harris seems to be trying to do. Well, yeah, maybe he is, maybe he isn't. He isn't, but it's not that far from what he's trying to do. But it's very different from the first. And it's that first thing, which is what linguists have remembered as the claim that Zellig Harris was out to do that. That is to say, that he was out to create an algorithm which would, from data, generate grammars. Now, let me say, there are a lot of people today trying to do exactly that. It's not crazy. I'm one of the people. But it's not what Harris was trying to do. I'd like to compare the 1955-56 version of LSLT with the version that was published in 1975 with respect to exactly this passage that we're covering, because there's a discrepancy, and from the point of view of what I'm focusing on here right now, it's a big discrepancy. So let's take a look. As we just looked at that material, we saw that Chomsky used the term procedural theory to describe a conception of linguistics in which you construct an algorithm, a black box, where you put data in and out comes a grammar. Nobody's proposing to do that back in the 40s and 50s, but that's what Chomsky's setting up as his notion of procedural theory. Now, Chomsky takes a step back to consider a weaker position, and he writes, you see on the left here, a weaker requirement than this would be that given a grammar, the theory must provide a practical mechanical way of validating it, that is, of showing that it is in fact the best grammar of the language in a sense specified by the theory. Okay? So that's a view in which you don't have to come up with an algorithm that creates the grammar. You just have to check it, basically, to see if there's an algorithmic approach that'll say yes or no, this is the, well, either best or correct grammar of the language. Now Chomsky does something that I think is really wrong, and it's playing with the terminology here in a way that we really have to resist. Okay, the next sentence is, extending the sense of procedural theory to cover this case. That's the problem, okay? That's the problem. Extending the sense of procedural theory to cover this case, we can say that a procedural theory provides a practical decision procedure for the notion grammar of a language. That's really wrong, because we have to keep very clear the distinction between thinking that we're going to have a method that automatically comes up with a grammar versus a method which, given data and a grammar, gives some kind of judgment about how good that grammar is. That's the distinction that's playing such a big role in the world of mathematical logic. It's the difference between deciding that a proof is valid and somebody gives you the proof, on the one hand, and given a hypothesis, is it a theorem? That is there a proof that'll prove it? Well, that's very, very hard. Okay, and it's this distinction which Chomsky starts out by using such a distinction, and now terminologically he's putting them together, which we shouldn't do. All right. Then the next sentence is, this would seem to be the proper interpretation for the kind of theory that Harris is interested in building in his methods in structural linguistics. Well, so what do we learn? So Chomsky is saying that it's this second approach which he believes Harris is trying to do. But now he's free to say that this is a procedural theory, and conceptually we've eliminated the distinction between whether you think you can create a grammar given a set of data automatically or not. And that's a huge difference. All right. So is this a proper interpretation of what Harris does, or what he's proposing that linguistics should do in the 50s? No. First of all, Harris is perfectly happy with multiple analyses. There isn't one best one. And second of all, when he takes a set of assumptions about what a grammar ought to look like, he continually makes the grammar better and better. He considers various hypotheses about how to manipulate it, how to make it better, cleaner, sharper, more insightful. And so at the end of the day, there's never a moment at which Harris is willing to say, and the grammar can't be made any better. Well, that's exactly the conception of how to do linguistic theory that Chomsky's going to put in the next stepping back, where we compare different grammars. So this is really an important step here if we're going to understand the sense in which Chomsky really misrepresents what Harris is trying to do. That middle category of conceptions of linguistic theory, in which it's said that the linguistic theory will say yes or no, this is the best grammar. Harris rejects that for two reasons. First of all, because there can be many correct grammars for a given set of data. And second of all, within a particular set of assumptions, there's no point at which you want to say, I'm certain there's no way to improve this grammar. This is important. Then in the published version, the 1975 version of LSLT, shows these two sentences have evolved into the following sentence. Such a theory provides a practical decision procedure for the notion grammar of a language. So we've turned from discovery procedure to decision procedure. That's the important distinction, and that's right. It's right to keep the two different. But we've lost the reference to Harris, and the reasons that I gave before to indicate why this second approach does not describe what Harris was in fact interested in. There's no response to that. There's just the allusion to Zellig Harris, which disappears in the published version. And then after that, the two editions, the 56 and the 75, are parallel. Let's draw this discussion to a close then. What I've tried to show you is the way in which Chomsky's ideas compared to Harris's, and the important ways in which Chomsky basically misrepresented the central approach that Harris was trying to take in his work in the 1940s, and the work that was put together in his Methods in Structural Linguistics. So why is this important? Well, it's important for me for two reasons. One is I'm really interested in how knowledge evolves, and that interest has come out in a book I published last year with Bernard Lax called Battle in the Minefields. The material that I've talked about just now is material that's going to go in a follow-up book that we're in the process of writing. At the same time, this material is important because the question of discovery procedures has come back. And in the context of machine learning, which is a field essentially of computer science that came into its own in the mid-1980s. So the journal called Machine Learning, for example, was set up in 1985. And over the last 30 years, machine learning has had an enormous impact on a large number of fields. And there are a lot of linguists, some computational linguists, some theoretical linguists, whose work has been greatly influenced by machine learning, and I'm one of them. And if we're going to understand the relationship of machine learning to general linguistic theory, we have to go back and look at the history of our discipline and see how our conception of ourselves as a discipline has been influenced by how we view linguistic analysis and how it would relate to machine learning. I've been struck a couple times by colleagues in linguistics who have looked at work, some of it in linguistics, some of it in machine learning, and have said, "Oh, that's just a matter of discovery procedures." And what I think is important for you to realize is that in Chomsky's discussion, and here it seems to me there's no question that he's right, if we could provide a linguistic theory that in fact had discovery procedures that worked, we'd be in great shape. That's the highest bar. That's exactly what we want. And I've just been struck by reading people who write about pre-generative linguistics, and they say, well, they only had discovery procedures. That was all that they were trying to do, without understanding that that's huge. If you've got a discovery procedure, that's great, and that's surely what we want to have. I have to interrupt myself right there because this is about a month later than the video that I made, and just by accident I came across a letter that Noam sent to me. Oh gosh, this must be 25, 30 years ago, and I think it was in connection with a book that I published with Jeff Huck. The book came out in 1995, and so the discussions were well before then. Anyway, and I'm going to say Noam now because this is a personal letter that he wrote. And he makes the following comment. He says, well, on page 17 of your manuscript about, quote, mechanical procedures. And he wrote, it might be useful to emphasize that in a sense, I am still looking for a mechanical discovery procedure. Namely, the structure of a universal language acquisition device constitutes, in a sense, a discovery procedure for grammars. I think that the issue can perhaps better be regarded not as one having to do with the existence of a discovery procedure, but rather with its character. Thus, as I pointed out, say, in the first chapter of Language and Mind, I really agree with the post-Bloomfieldians in their search for a discovery procedure, some discussion at the end of the chapter. Rather, their assumptions about the nature of this procedure were inaccurate ultimately, because they were derived from the equally erroneous assumption, purely dogmatic, I believe, of empiricism. This relates to the whole matter of, quote, empiricism versus, quote, rationalism, etc., as I've tried to explain it in my, quote, rational reconstruction, or the debate over behaviorism. I return to it in connection with later points that you... Okay, so putting it all together, this is what you need to know about Zellig Harris's work in the 40s, and how Chomsky's conception of generative grammar grew out of that, and how Chomsky conceived of his approach and how it related to generative grammar, and what you need to know about discovery procedures.